Hi guys, and welcome to the final lecture for Chapter 6. Today we're going to kind of put everything together and talk about both the total fertility rate as well as the demographic transition model. Let's take a look. Now, the total fertility rate is essentially the average number of children a woman will give birth to in her lifetime for a given population. And when you think of the total fertility rate, what I want you to think of is the number 2.1. 2.1 refers to the replacement rate. This is the total fertility rate needed in a population to keep that population's numbers static or constant through time. A total fertility rate greater than 2.1 will cause the population growth rate to increase, and that means that our populations are getting bigger and bigger and bigger. If the total fertility rate is lower than 2.1, conversely, that means that we aren't producing enough children in that population to keep that population's number stable, and that population will be continually shrinking for each unit time. So again, 2.1 is the number needed to keep the population's growth rate at 0. Anything above will make the population increase. Anything below 2.1 will make the population decrease. Now, historically speaking, the total fertility rate has always been pretty high when we look at global families. And this used to be a good thing. Historically, we also really had a very high death rate. And so having a high total fertility rate allowed us to compensate. We were having high birth rates to compensate for the high death rates. However, over time, death rates have begun to drop as countries have become increasingly developed. So we now are interested in lowering our total fertility rate. Now, there are several reasons for the decline in the total fertility rate, and we're going to go over the specifics behind each one of them and how they lower the number of children a woman produces over the course of her lifetime in a population on average. The first is medical care. Increases in medical care and the ability of a country or a government to provide medical care for its citizens drastically reduces infant mortality. When infant mortality is reduced, households become less likely to do something called bet hedging with very large families. Now, what bet hedging is when a person repeats a process over and over and over again to increase the likelihood that one attempt out of all the attempts they tried would succeed. Now, households would bet hedge by having very large numbers of children because there was a very high infant mortality rate. So by having a very large family and large numbers of children, they increased the likelihood that at least one child was going to survive all the way to adulthood. However, with increases in medical care, the probability that a child will die as an infant drastically is reduced. Therefore, the probability that even the first child born in a family will survive to adulthood, it becomes very, very high. As a result, households no longer need to bet hedge with high families because all kids are going to probably survive to adulthood, and so this in and of itself reduces the total fertility rate within a population. Next, urbanization lowers the total fertility rate by shifting the economics of big families from being economically beneficial to an economic drain on a family or a given household. Now, having a high family, historically speaking, particularly when we had more of an agrarian society, was a good thing. If you had a large number of children, you were going to have a large number of people that could help out on the farm, or a large number of people that could go out to work early on at a young age and bring in more money for the family. So having a large family was originally beneficial. However, with urbanization, the costs for childhood begins to increase. All of a sudden, you need to have daycare and pediatricians and all of these costs associated with having any one child. In addition, because of labor laws associated with urbanization, children have to go to school instead of going to work. So instead of them bringing in that money, they are now going to school and no longer bringing in any money for the family. In addition to all of that, one of the big benefits of having a large number of children was so that you would have a large number of people to support you when you got old as a parent. Once you became old and decrepit, you had a large number of children to count on to take care of you in your old age. However, Social Security programs associated with urbanization remove that need. Instead of having a lot of children to help you out, instead you get benefits from the government in the form of Social Security payments to take care of you in your old age. So you no longer need to have a big family to take care of you. All of these basically shift the economics of having a big family from a net benefit to a net cost and liability, and it no longer makes them desirable. As one quote that I heard recently that made me laugh put it, children are still emotionally priceless, but they are now economically worthless. Birth control is a pretty straightforward way to lower the total fertility rate, basically by providing citizens in a given country access to birth control as well as other types of contraceptives. You lower the likelihood of having an accidental pregnancy, and so you decrease the total fertility rate that way. Education is a great way to lower the total fertility rate, and specifically education of women in developing countries. In a lot of developing countries, for certain cultural reasons, unfortunately, there can be a deficit in the number of educated women in that society. By providing education to women in those developing countries, you provide them an outlet to do something other than just serve as a unit in the family. You provide them with the option of pursuing careers, either in blue-collar or in white-collar jobs, and allow them to contribute to the workforce. In doing so, women are also given different choices. Education and knowledge is power, and knowing that you have other options other than just serving in the family will empower you to make your own decisions. So education is a great way to lower the total fertility rate in developing countries where cultural boundaries have historically disenfranchised women's education and women's rights. In addition to all of this, life expectancy or increased life expectancy is another way to greatly lower the total fertility rate. If there is a long life expectancy in a given society or population, there is less pressure to start a family young, and so women and households can delay pregnancy or the initial pregnancy until much later in life, and because you delay the window where you start having kids, you have a tendency to lower the total number of kids you have in your family. So on average, the total fertility rate also drops. Now, women's empowerment is a very great way to lower the total fertility rate. Basically, studies have shown that when women are freer to decide for themselves, they tend to delay motherhood, and this intuitively makes sense. Most of us don't want to go out and start a family very early on in life. We want to start our careers or get other aspects of our life moving forward before going and starting a family. As a result, though, as developing countries continue to improve women's rights, total fertility rates continue to fall. In addition, children in those countries become happier, healthier, better educated, and generally more well cared for. Now, this also intuitively makes sense. If we have a very large family, there's going to be a limited amount of energy and time and attention that we can give to any one child. If we reduce the size of that family, we greatly increase the amount of time, attention, and energy we can devote for any one given child, and so that child becomes better cared for. And again, we can't really talk about women's empowerment without talking about education. Access to education greatly increases opportunities for women, both in the job sector as well as in social standing, and contributes to women's empowerment. Financial independence, specifically allowing women to go out and make money for themselves, greatly diminishes their need to become married and start families very early. They can go out and forge things for themselves simply by going and starting a great career. And just having the knowledge of greater options through education will give a greater say in reproductive decisions. Just knowing what options are available to women is a great way to also lower the total fertility rate. And again, this kind of goes back to the tendency of people wanting to delay motherhood, or if you're male, delaying the start of a family. Most of us want to do other things before we start a family, and having the knowledge that those other things are out there is a great way to delay or to lower the total fertility rate. Now, while all of the other factors that we talked about are important in lowering the total fertility rate of a given country, family planning is the most important way, because it is the single greatest factor in slowing a population's growth rate and lowering the total fertility rate of a population. And this is for a number of different things. Family planning often educates families and makes an effort for families to plan the number and spacing of the children that they want to have. Basically, this is going to entail how many kids that you actually want, as well as when you want to have those kids. And just planning out a family tends to reduce the total number of kids a given family will have. In addition, family planning makes ample access of providing birth control and contraceptives to families. And again, going back to what we already talked about, this can dramatically reduce total fertility rates because you decrease accidental pregnancies. And because birth control and contraceptives are perhaps the largest component of family planning, things like IUDs, condoms, and permanent sterilization, family planning has the greatest impact in lowering the total fertility rate of a given population. Check out some of the graphs that we have over on the right-hand right-hand side of your screen. In blue are going to be countries that implemented family planning practices, and in red are going to be countries that did not implement family planning practices. What you're going to see is that while the trends are going to be going down regardless of whether family planning was implemented or not, family planning significantly reduces the total fertility rate of a country compared to a very comparable country which did not utilize family planning strategies. And so, with all else equal, the implementation of family planning practices dramatically lowers total fertility rates in countries. Now, because the total fertility rate is extremely important and we spent so much time on the total fertility rate, I'm really going to ask that you make sure you understand the concepts that we just talked about. However, for the latter half of the lecture, we're going to switch gears here and talk instead about something called the demographic transition model. The demographic transition model is a model of cultural and economic change through time, which tracks the population growth rate of a country as it moves from one stage of development to another. And what the demographic transition model is going to do is it's going to pull from themes and concepts that we've all talked about in demographics and population growth dynamics, and it's going to pull them together to synthesize a model that tracks how populations change in a country as the country increasingly becomes more and more and more developed. Now, there are four basic stages in the demographic transition model. The first is the pre-industrial stage, the second is the transitional stage, the third is the industrial stage, and the fourth and final one is the post-industrial stage. All of these are very important, and all of them have different factors at play that causes increases or decreases in population growth rate. A lot of this is going to have to do with the birth rate and the death rate associated with a given country, and we're going to dive into how each of these factors influence population growth at each stage in the demographic transition model. Let's take a look. Now, the first stage of the demographic transition model is known as the pre-industrial stage. And when you think of the pre-industrial stage, think of a very, very undeveloped country, or think of how civilizations operated in the distant past. In the pre-industrial stage of the demographic transition model, the death rate and the birth rate are both very high. So the death rate is going to be very high because there's not going to be a lot of food security. And so because of unreliable food availability, there's going to be a lot of starvation. In addition, without modern medicine and modern sanitation, there's going to be a lot of death from disease and unsanitary conditions. So the death rate is very high. However, the birth rate is also very high in the pre-industrial stage because the birth rate attempts to compensate for that very high death rate. Remember that any time that we have a very high death rate, we need to have a very high birth rate to make sure the population stays balanced. So the birth rate is very high to compensate for this high death rate. And in addition, the birth rate is very high because of a lack of use of contraceptives or family planning or any sort of education. So as a result, because the high death rate equals the high birth rate, the population growth rate is relatively flat and the population is fairly low in number. But as a country continues to develop, it begins to move from the pre-industrial stage to the transitional stage. And in the transitional stage, the death rate begins to drop. And this is for a number of reasons. As a country becomes more and more industrialized, there becomes increased food availability because more farmers are growing food, and so food becomes more secure. There's going to be less famine and less starvation and less death associated with famine and starvation as we move into the transitional stage. In addition, as a country becomes increasingly industrialized, there is increased access to better and better medical care and better sanitation. So again, the death rate begins to drop. However, in the transitional stage, the birth rate lags behind. This is due to a number of different factors. Societal norms haven't changed yet, and society in general hasn't really adjusted to the lower death rate. And so we are now overcompensating for a dropping death rate with a birth rate that remains pretty high. Now, remember that any time that we have a birth rate very much higher than a death rate, that means the population growth rate is going to increase. And in the transitional stage, the population growth rate skyrockets because of this discrepancy between the death rate and the birth rate. Now, moving forward, as a country moves from the transitional stage to the industrial stage, the death rate stays low. And this is because the conditions are only going to improve. We're going to only have better and better access to food, and we're going to have increasingly better medicine as well as sanitation in our societies. So the death rate stays pretty low. However, in the industrial stage, we are beginning to adapt to having a lower death rate, and so the birth rate finally gradually begins to come down. This is for a number of different reasons. First, in the industrial stage, we're beginning to make widespread use of contraceptives, and again, this is going to come with urbanization, which begins to shift the economics of families, so children become less economically valuable. Child labor laws again means that they can't provide income, and the cost to feed children now greatly outweighs the economic benefit of children. Refer back to how urbanization lowers the total fertility rate in a given society. In addition, with industrialized nations, we begin to provide access to women's rights as well as women's education. So we generally are going to be promoting women's empowerment as a country becomes more and more industrialized. And so women get access to jobs, they have an incentive to delay motherhood, and they gain more autonomy and more power. Because of all of these factors, our birth rate continues to drop as a country continues to move from the transitional stage to the industrial stage. Now, as our birth rate begins to drop and meet our death rate, the population growth rate in the industrial stage begins to drop. So now we are still increasing our populations, but we are increasing our populations at a slower and slower and slower rate. And this brings us to the final stage in our demographic transition model, the post-industrial stage. In the post-industrial stage, the death rate stays nice and low for reasons that we've already talked about, and the birth rate has now dropped down to where it is approximately equal to our death rate. This means that our population has finally stopped growing and it is now stabilized at a much larger population. Keep in mind that the population has been growing throughout this entire time through each stage of the demographic transition model. So while the population is now the highest it's ever been, the death rate and the birth rate are now the lowest that they have ever been. So in contrast to the pre-industrial stage, which had very high death rates, high birth rates, and a very low population, in the post-industrial stage, we now have very low death rates, low birth rates, and a very high population. So now we have reached a very high and stable population. Now, this is everything I have for you guys for Chapter 6. I hope you guys have enjoyed this chapter on human population dynamics. Next, we will be moving into soils and agriculture. I'll see you there for Chapter 7.